Today, Dr. Jairo Adrian and myself would like to explore a form of queer sense-making that emerges from life in the borderlands, where instability, contradiction, and embodiment become sources of knowledge rather than obstacles to it. In most Western academic and nationalist knowledge systems, things like body experience, sexuality, emotional contradiction, cultural hybridity, linguistic mixture are treated as problems or noise. They are seen as subjective instead of objective, unstable instead of reliable, emotional instead of rational, and excessive instead of disciplined. In other words, they are framed as obstacles to proper knowledge. Our talk is titled The Body Knows Otherwise, Queer Bordergnosis in the Chicana Literature of Cherry Moraga and Ana Castillo. We argue that in their work, the body, particularly the queer, racialized, and desiring body, functions as a site of epistemological production. That is, the body knows things that dominant ideological systems refuse to acknowledge. Chicana literature has long functioned as a crucial space for articulating identities that exist at the margins of dominant US culture. Writers such as Moraga and Castillo intervene simultaneously in two discursive fields. On the one hand, Anglo-American heteropatriarchal norms, and on the other, forms of Chicano nationalism that often rely on fixed notions of gender, sexuality, and cultural authenticity. From a queer theoretical perspective, their work does not seek inclusion within existing frameworks. Instead, it disrupts the very category through which identity, belonging, and legitimacy are produced. Their texts refuse coherence when we think about the dominant discourse, and it is precisely in this refusal that their political force lies. This analysis is theoretically grounded in the work of Gloria Anzaldúa, particularly her concept of borderlands. For Anzaldúa, the border is not merely a geographical line, but an epistemological condition, a space of contradiction, ambiguity, and constant negotiation. Knowledge produced in the borderlands is unstable by definition. It emerges from what Anzaldúa calls nepantla, a state of in-betweenness where binaries break down and new ways of knowing become possible. It could be explained like, I approach the border here as a queer epistemic space, a site where instability is not a problem to be solved, but a condition of insight, of a necessary circumstance, something without which a phenomenon cannot occur. We use the term queer bordergnosis to describe this mode of knowledge production. By bordergnosis, we mean knowledge that emerges from living within contradiction. Knowledge shaped by cultural displacement, sexual dissidence, and embodied experience. By queer, we are not referring simply to identity, but to a critical practice, one that resists closure, coherence, and normative legibility. In this framework, knowing does not come from resolution, it comes from remaining with tension. The body, rather than abstract theory, becomes the primary site where this knowledge is generated. In both Moraga's Loving in the War Years and Castillo's I Asked the Impossible, the body occupies a central epistemological role. Sexuality is not framed as a private matter, but as a political epistemic force. Desire, pleasure, trauma, and vulnerability function as forms of knowledge that challenge dominant narratives about identity and morality. These texts insist that the body remembers what ideology attempts to erase. The queer body, in particular, becomes a site of resistance precisely because it exceeds the categories imposed upon it. It knows otherwise. In Moraga and Castillo, the border operates not only as a theme, but as a method of writing and thinking. Normative binaries such as heterosexual versus homosexual, public versus private, self versus other are continuously unsettled. The border is not something one crosses in these texts, it's something one inhabits. Rather than moving towards synthesis or resolution, both authors write from within contradiction, allowing instability to remain unresolved. And this refusal of closure is central to the queer politics. Linguistic hybridity plays a crucial role in this epistemological disruption. Both authors employ bilingualism strategically, often refusing translation. Spanish and English coexist without apology or explanation. This refusal of transparency functions as a queer practice. It resists assimilation into dominant literary conventions and disrupts the expectation that marginalized voices must take themselves legible to a presumed monolingual reader. Language here does not clarify meaning. It produces friction, and this friction is productive.
En México, las mujeres crawl on their hands and knees to the basilica door. This proves her faith.
Although Moraga and Castillo differ in genre, tone, narrative strategy, their work converges around a shared queer Chicana framework. Both authors reject essentialist notions of identity. Both foreground embodied experience as a legitimate source of knowledge, and both use literature as a form of political intervention. Cherry Moraga articulates sexuality as a site of intimate and collective struggle, while Ana Castillo explores desire, spirituality, and contradiction as forces that destabilized normative subjectivity. Together, their work expands the scope of queer literary discourse by situating it firmly within Chicana border epistemologies. To conclude, the work of Moraga and Castillo demonstrates that queer knowledge does not emerge from stability, coherence, or fixed identity categories. It emerges from embodied contradiction, from linguistic disruption, and from life lived in the borderlands. Their writing challenges dominant modes of knowledge production and offers powerful tools for thinking about queer resistance in contemporary Chicana literature. Finally, these texts remind us that the body knows otherwise, and that listening to that knowledge is both a political and an ethical act. Thank you very much for your attention.